The village of Chipping Devington was never more vibrant, nor more treacherous than during the annual harvest festival. It was a time when the bounties of the earth were displayed with a competitive ferocity that bordered on the pagan. The village green was transformed into a maze of hay bales, cider barrels, and trestle tables groaning under the weight of prize-winning produce. This year, the centerpiece of the festivities was the Great Cornucopia, a massive structure of woven wicker and autumn foliage erected near the ancient stone well. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, mulled ale, and the faint, sweet decay of fallen leaves. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible tweed coat and carrying her sturdy knitting bag, moved through the crowd with the quiet grace of a silver-haired ghost. She spent much of her morning near the honey stall, not out of a particular desire for clover nectar, but because it offered an unobstructed view of the entrance to the old tithe barn, where the village gentry had gathered for their private luncheon. She observed the village's hierarchy as if it were a complex piece of lace. There was Lady Constance, her face a mask of aristocratic boredom as she directed the placement of the floral arrangements. The vicar, whose nervous habit of checking his pocket watch suggested a man burdened by more than just his sermon, and the newcomer, Mr. Alistair Sterling, a wealthy industrialist who had recently purchased the Grange and proceeded to offend every local sensibility with his talk of modernizing the village infrastructure. Sterling was currently engaged in a heated, low-toned argument with the local blacksmith, Joe Higgins, whose face was the color of a ripe beet. To the casual observer, it was merely the usual friction between the old world and the new, but Miss Marple noted the way Sterling's hand trembled as he adjusted his silk tear sign of genuine fear rather than mere irritation. It reminded her of the time the postmaster in St. Mary Mead had tried to hide a gambling debt by pretending he had a recurring bout of gambling. The festivities reached their peak at mid-afternoon, as the sun began to cast long golden shadows across the stone church tower. The traditional offering of the first sheaf was about to commence, an event that required the removal of the heavy floral drapes surrounding the great cornucopia. The entire village gathered in a wide semicircle, the children hushed, and the elders leaning forward in anticipation. Lady Constance took the ceremonial silver shears, her movements practiced and elegant. With a swift snip of the velvet ribbon, the heavy garlands of wheat and hops fell away, revealing the interior of the wicker structure. A collective gasp, sharp as a winter frost, rippled through the crowd. Resting amidst the pumpkins and the gourds was not the ceremonial sheaf of grain, but the unmistakably still form of Mr. Alistair Sterling. He was dressed in his fine tweed suit, his eyes wide and clouded, and a single, perfectly preserved sprig of deadly nightshade was tucked into his breast pocket where his silk handkerchief should have been. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant cawing of a crow and the soft, rhythmic creak of the village well's handle in the wind. Sir Henry, the retired magistrate, was the first to move, stepping forward with a look of profound, professional gravity. He checked for a pulse and slowly shook his head, his face turning a ghastly shade of grey. The industrialist who had come to change the village had instead been silenced by it, and the manner of his death staged amidst the symbols of the harvest suggested a crime of deep, symbolic intent. Miss Marple did not join the throng of shocked onlookers pressing toward the wicker structure. Instead, she stayed where she was, her eyes not on the body, but on the faces in the crowd. She saw the vicar's wife turn away with a look of sudden, intense nausea, and she noticed Joe Higgins, the blacksmith, quietly retreating into the shadows of the tithe barn, his hands buried deep in his leather apron. As the first screams of the younger villagers began to puncture the stillness, Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. She noticed a small, seemingly insignificant detail near the base of the cornucopia, a discarded copper button, tarnished and old-fashioned, lying half-hidden in the straw. It was a button that didn't match Mr. Sterling's expensive London tailoring, but it was one she had seen before on a very different garment in the village. The hook had been set, and the peaceful routine of Chipping Devington had been shattered by a crime that felt as old as the stones of the well itself. The harvest had yielded a bitter crop, and as the shadows deepened over the green, Miss Marple knew that the secrets of the village were about to be harvested along with the grain. The celebration was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The transition from the vibrant chaos of the harvest festival to the oppressive, funereal atmosphere of the following evening was as swift as the turning of a page. By the time the morning mist had cleared from the hollows of Chipping Devington, the village had transformed into a sprawling theatre of hushed conversations and pointed glances. At the Blue Boar, the usual Saturday morning bustle was replaced by a heavy, expectant air, where the clink of a teacup sounded like a gavel, and every creak of the floorboards invited a suspicious turn of the head. The great cornucopia remained on the green, now cordoned off by a length of yellow police tape that fluttered in the breeze like a festive banner gone wrong, a stark reminder that the harvest had yielded something far more sinister than prize-winning marrows. The primary theatre for this exchange of theories was the small, wood-panelled snug of the inn, where the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the low, frantic humming of voices. Mrs. Pringle, the postmistress, was already established as the unofficial herald of the tragedy, her voice rising and falling with theatrical precision as she recounted the look of pure devilry she had supposedly seen in Mr. Stirling's eyes just moments before the luncheon. To Mrs. Pringle and her circle of confidants, the crime was clearly the work of a London syndicate. They argued that a man of Stirling's industrial influence must have left a trail of ruined rivals in the city, one of whom had followed him to the quiet countryside to deliver a final, dramatic blow. It was a comforting narrative for many. If the killer was a faceless stranger from the city, the village could remain a sanctuary of traditional virtue, conveniently ignoring the fact that the deadly nightshade was a plant that grew in abundance behind the local schoolhouse. However, beneath this layer of defensive speculation, a sharper and more localized form of gossip was beginning to take root. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner with a small glass of ginger wine, watched as the villagers processed the news like a complex chemical reaction. She noted that while the louder voices blamed the syndicate, the quieter, more meaningful exchanges were directed toward Joe Higgins, the blacksmith. It was pointed out, with many a significant nod, that Joe's forge had been cold for 3 days, a rare occurrence for a man who prided himself on his industry. Others whispered about the heated argument Stirling had had with the vicar over the proposed widening of the church lane, a project that would have required the demolition of several ancient ancestral cottages. Each theory offered by the villagers was a mirror of their own anxieties. The gentry looked toward the dangerous elements of the labouring class, while the shopkeepers looked toward the arrogant interlopers who threatened their way of life. The reaction at Vicarage was more telling. The vicar's wife, who had been so physically affected at the discovery, was seen by several people frantically polishing the silver in the church hall, a task she usually delegated to the Ladies' Guild. Her movements were jerky and frantic, as if she were trying to scrub away a stain that only she could see. When approached for a comment, she spoke only of the unfortunate timing and the burden on the parish, a choice of words that Miss Marple found particularly revealing. It was the language of someone who viewed a murder not as a tragedy, but as a logistical inconvenience to be managed. In St. Mary Mead, when the schoolmaster had been found in the pond, the headmistress had behaved in much the same way, obsessing over the seating arrangements for the funeral before the body was even cold. Miss Marple listened as the local solicitor, Mr. Ponsonby, argued that Stirling's death was likely a tragic accident, perhaps a confused reaction to a heart stimulant that had been mislabeled. It was a lawyer's theory, designed to remove the element of human malice and restore the village to its state of legal equilibrium. But Miss Marple knew that accidents did not include carefully placing deadly nightshade in a breast pocket. The gossip was not merely a way of processing the event, it was a collective effort to build a wall of words to hide the fact that everyone in the room had a reason to wish Alistair Stirling gone. The industrialist had been a catalyst, a man whose presence had forced the village to choose between its future and its secrets, and the harvest had merely been the moment the bill came due. As the afternoon light faded into a bruised purple, the initial shock began to harden into a pervasive sense of suspicion. Neighbours who had shared harvest ale for decades now looked at each other with a new, guarded sharpness. The body beneath the harvest festival had echoed through every house. As the theories grew more elaborate, the truth became more obscured by the layers of village pride and personal resentment. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and looked at the faces around her. She knew that the truth was not to be found in the loud proclamations of the postmistress or the nervous evasions of the solicitor. It was hidden in the quiet moments, in the things that weren't being said, and in the way Joe Higgins looked at his own soot-stained hands whenever the inspector's name was mentioned. The village was reacting exactly as she expected to be, looking everywhere, except at the person sitting in the next chair. The following morning, the village of Chipping Devington was subjected to the brisk, unimaginative efficiency of Inspector Slack, who arrived with a screech of tires and a notebook held like a shield against the morning mist, while Slack was busy cordoning off the tithe barn and barking orders at the local POW. To begin a systematic search of the Sterling estate for financial records, Miss Marple was engaged in a much more delicate form of inquiry. She spent her morning in the small, sun-drenched garden of the old vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the health of the vicar's prize-winning dahlias, but her real focus was on the subtle choreography of movement across the village green. To the inspector, the murder was a problem of mechanical forceth, time of death, the chemical composition of the nightshade, and the physical proximity of suspects. To Miss Marple, however, it was a problem of rhythmic disruption, and she had already noticed 3 distinct breaks in the village's habitual melody. The first pattern involved the local blacksmith, Joe Higgins, who was usually the very soul of predictable industry. His forge remained cold, yet he was seen 3 times before noon crossing the green toward the post office, each time carrying a small, heavy wooden box that he appeared anxious to conceal beneath his leather apron. The second break was even more subtle. The vicar's wife had failed to attend the Monday morning committee meeting for the first time in a decade, claiming a sudden migraine, yet Miss Marple had observed her through the hedge, frantically digging in a corner of the kitchen garden that had been fallow for years. The third and perhaps most telling observation was the behaviour of Lady Constance. Instead of her usual commanding presence, she was seen sitting on a bench near the well for nearly an hour, her eyes fixed not on the crime scene, but on the ancient stone sundial, her fingers compulsively twisting a strand of pearls until the silk thread looked ready to snap. Miss Marple's early investigation was rooted in the understanding that when a large stone is thrown into a pond, the ripples are most revealing where they hit the shallowest water. She left the vicarage and made her way toward the blacksmith's forge, where she encountered Dr. Haydock emerging from the small cottage next door. The doctor looked aged and remarkably haggard for a man who had only been called upon to declare a death. They spoke briefly of the terrible business, and the doctor mentioned, with a curious tremor in his voice, that the cause of death appeared to be a concentrated form of alkaloid poisoning, likely ingested through a tainted drink or a treated glass. He seemed particularly troubled by the nightshade in the pocket, calling it a ghastly piece of melodrama. Miss Marple noted that while he spoke, he was repeatedly checking the cuffs of his shirt, which was stained with a dark, waxy residue that didn't quite match the mud of the churchyard. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple paused by the great cornucopia where the police had finished their initial sweep. She didn't look at the wicker structure, she looked at the straw. She noticed that a specific patch of bedding near the base had been flattened in a peculiar, rectangular shape, as if a heavy trunk or perhaps a mason's stone had rested there before the body was placed. This observation, combined with the discarded copper button she had seen the previous day, began to form a very specific picture in her mind. The button was of a type used on the livery of the local estate 40 years ago, a detail that linked the current industrialist's death to a history that Mr. Sterling could not possibly have shared. The inspector was currently focused on the obvious clues: the heated argument between the blacksmith and the victim, and the potential for a business rival to have infiltrated the festival. But Miss Marple was thinking of the dahlias. She knew that the vicar's wife had been obsessing over a specific type of soil enrichment that involved the use of certain nightshade extracts, a fact she had mentioned quite casually at the last tea gathering. Why would a woman so dedicated to her garden be so terrified of the very plant she had been studying? It was a detail that felt almost too convenient, like a deliberate signpost for the police. In Chipping Devington, when someone wanted to hide a secret, they didn't just bury it, they often tried to plant it in someone else's garden. By the time she returned to her lodgings, Miss Marple had synthesized several seemingly unrelated facts. She thought of the cold forge, the frantic digging, and the waxy residue on the doctor's cuffs. The inspector was looking for a murderer, but Miss Marple was looking for a set of circumstances that had forced a respectable person into a corner. She realized that Alistair Sterling hadn't just been a victim of a crime, He had been the catalyst for a situation that had become unbearable for someone who remembered the village as it was before the money arrived. The patterns of behavior she had observed were not signs of guilt in the legal sense, but signs of a collective, suffocating fear. The early investigation was over, and the first suspects were about to be served by police. But Miss Marple knew that the real hand behind the nightshade was still hidden behind a mask of impeccable village virtue. By the second afternoon of the investigation, Inspector Slack had convinced himself that the case was as straightforward as a garden path. His attention had locked onto Joe Higgins, the blacksmith, whose cold forge and heated history with the victim made him the perfect candidate for a quick arrest. The inspector had discovered that Sterling's modernization plans included the demolition of the old smithy to make way for a new road, a move that would have stripped Higgins of both his livelihood and his ancestral home. When a search of the smithy's coal shed revealed a small, half-empty bottle of nightshade tincture tucked behind a pile of iron scraps, Slack felt his triumph was complete. He marched across the green with the air of a man who had solved the impossible, ignoring the quiet, skeptical gaze of Miss Marple, who was sitting on a nearby bench, her knitting needles clicking a rhythmic, doubting tempo. To the inspector, the motive and means were a perfectly matched set, a man of the earth driven to a desperate act by the threat of industrial progress. Higgins was taken into custody amidst a flurry of official barking and the indignant protests of the local tradesmen. The police were eager to close the file, viewing the evidence as an insurmountable wall of guilt. Yet, Miss Marple remained profoundly unconvinced. She had known men like Joe Higgins all her life, men with fierce tempers and rough hands, but with hearts that lacked the icy theatrical calculation required to stage a body inside a wicker cornucopia. To kill a man in a moment of rage was one thing, but to pose him amidst harvest gourds with a symbolic sprig of poison was the work of a much more sophisticated, perhaps even literary, mind. It was the melodrama that Dr. Haydock had mentioned, a flourish that felt entirely alien to a man who dealt in the honest, heavy reality of iron and fire. Miss Marple's skepticism was further bolstered by her observations of the village elite as they reacted to the arrest. She noticed Lady Constance standing on the terrace of the manor, her binoculars fixed not on the departing police car, but on the church lane. There was a look of profound relief on her face, but it was a brittle, fragile sort of relief that didn't quite reach her eyes. Miss Marple recalled a similar expression on the face of a poultry farmer's wife in St. Mary Mead, who had been relieved when the fox was blamed for a missing necklace, only to realize the search would eventually lead to the floorboards. If Higgins were truly the killer, why would Lady Constance look so terrified every time the inspector turned his head in her direction? Furthermore, there was the matter of the copper button she had found in the straw. It was a livery button, a relic of a time when the village hierarchy was absolute and the manor ruled with an unquestioned hand. Joe Higgins, for all his local roots, had never worn such a uniform, nor would he have kept such a memento. The button spoke of the past, of service, and of a social order that Alistair Sterling had been systematically dismantling. Miss Marple realized that the inspector was looking for a man with a motive for the future, but the real murderer was likely someone with a motive for the past. The nightshade wasn't just a poison, it was a message, a signature of someone who viewed Sterling as a weed in a very old, very private garden. As the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the green, Miss Marple observed the vicar's wife emerging from her kitchen garden. The woman's hands were stained with a dark, damp earth that didn't match the light, sandy soil of the parsonage. She looked exhausted, her usual sharp efficiency replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. Miss Marple noted that she avoided looking at the smithy altogether, her gaze instead fixed on the tithe barn where Sterling had taken his last meal. It was the behavior of a woman who had accepted a convenient scapegoat, but was still haunted by the physical reality of what had occurred. The village was closing ranks, attempting to bury the crime under the weight of Joe Higgins' supposed guilt, but the loose threads remained visible to anyone who knew where to look. She walked back to her lodgings slowly, her mind working through the geometry of the village's secrets. The inspector had his suspect, his bottle of tincture, and his motive of industrial conflict. But he didn't have the why that connected a 40-year-old copper button to a modern industrialist. To Miss Marple, The arrest of the blacksmith was merely a temporary pause in a much larger and more dangerous performance. She knew that the real killer was someone who understood the village's history far better than the inspector ever would, someone who had used the harvest festival as a stage for a very personal reckoning. As she reached her door, she realized that the inspector's success would only embolden the true murderer to make their final, decisive move to ensure the secrets of Chipping Divington remained buried beneath the autumn leaves. The following morning, a persistent, drizzling rain descended upon Chipping Divington, turning the vibrant remnants of the harvest festival into a sodden, melancholic mess of grey straw and wilting flowers. While Inspector Slack was at the station, basking in the glow of what he considered a watertight case against Joe Higgins, Miss Marple was engaged in a much more delicate task. She was sitting in the small, cluttered back room of the village apothecary, ostensibly to purchase a specific type of herbal lozenge for a non-existent cough. Mr. Gillingham, the apothecary, was a man of precise habits and a nervous disposition, and as he searched the high shelves, Miss Marple's keen eyes were not on the medicine bottles, but on the small, wooden counter where the local prescriptions were filed. It was here that she noticed a minor, seemingly unimportant detail that shifted the entire focus of her internal investigation. Tucked into the corner of a blotter was a small, torn fragment of a delivery receipt from a London seed merchant, dated 3 weeks prior. It wasn't the receipt itself that caught her attention, but the specific item listed in a hurried, elegant hand: Digitalis purpurea, concentrated extract, for soil testing. To a casual observer, it was merely a horticultural order, but Miss Marple, who had a surprising memory for the more lethal aspects of organic chemistry, recognized it as a component that, while useful for heart ailments, was remarkably similar in its final, refined state to the nightshade alkaloids found in Stirling's system. More importantly, the receipt was addressed to the Old Tithe Barn Restoration Committee, a group chaired by the vicar's wife and funded entirely by Lady Constance. This meant that the means for a sophisticated poisoning had been brought into the village under a legitimate, even charitable, guise long before Joe Higgins had even begun to argue with the victim. This discovery transformed the murder from a crime of hot-blooded passion into a cold, clinical operation of meticulous preparation. Miss Marple realized that the nightshade tincture found in the blacksmith's shed was likely a crude plant, a stage prop designed to lead the police to the most convenient local culprit. The hidden clue of the London receipt suggested a conspiracy that involved the most unlikely of allies. Miss Marple thought of the copper button again, that relic of a bygone era of service. She recalled a similar situation in St. Mary Mead involving a retired butler who had kept his uniform buttons as a reminder of his former glory, only to have one become the undoing of his mistress. If the button belonged to a former servant of the manor, why was it at the scene of an industrialist's death? She realized that Alistair Stirling hadn't just been a victim of modern greed, he had been the victim of a very old, very private history. The development of the meadow wasn't just about roads and infrastructure, it was about the excavation of a specific area of the tithe barn that had remained undisturbed since the Great War. The soil testing mentioned on the receipt was a clever euphemism for something much more clandestine. As she left the apothecary's and walked through the rain, Miss Marple noticed another small detail that everyone else had overlooked. Near the village well, where the great cornucopia had stood, a small, discarded piece of blue wax was snagged on a stone. It was a very specific shade of midnight blue, the exact colour of the wax seals used by the solicitor, Mr. Ponsonby, for privileged estate documents. Miss Marple paused, her heart heavy with the implication. She remembered the solicitor's theory about a tragic accident involving mislabeled stimulants. It wasn't a lawyer's theory after all, it was a lawyer's confession, or at least a redirection. The blue wax and the London receipt pointed away from the forge and toward the professional heart of the village. Miss Marple realized that the inspector was looking for a man with a motive for theft, but she was looking for a community that had collectively decided that Alistair Stirling was a threat to their shared survival. The minor detail of the seed merchant's receipt was the first thread in a tapestry of deceit that stretched back 40 years. As she walked back to her lodgings, her mind synthesized the discordance. The blacksmith was in no danger of being hanged, provided she could prove the origin of the soil testing extract, but the person who had truly prepared that wicker display was currently preparing for a final, desperate move to silence the only witness left. The rain continued to fall, washing away the festive colours of the festival, but for Miss Marple, the true colours of the conspirators were finally beginning to emerge through the gloom. The rainy twilight seemed to draw the walls of Chipping Devington closer together, turning the village into a labyrinth of damp stone and long-buried grievances. Miss Marple, seated in her small drawing-room with a glass of elderberry wine, found herself playing host to an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Bantry. Her friend was in a state of high agitation, having just returned from a disastrous bridge party at the manor where the atmosphere had been more akin to a court-martial than a social gathering. It was through Dolly Bantry's indignant ramblings that the deeper fractures of the village's history began to emerge, revealing that the body beneath the harvest festival was merely the final chapter in a saga that had begun during the chaos of the Great War. The industrialist, Mr. Sterling, had not just been a stranger with a checkbook. He was a man who had come to the village with a very specific map of the past, and that map had threatened to expose the origin of the village's most respected fortunes. According to Mrs. Bantry, the tension between Lady Constance and the late Mr. Sterling was rooted in a discovery made during the initial survey of the tithe barn. It appeared that Sterling had found evidence of a systematic theft of military supplies that had occurred 40 years ago, when the manor served as a temporary hospital. The soil testing Miss Marple had noted on the seed merchant's receipt was a cover for a clandestine excavation conducted by Sterling himself. He had been looking for a hidden cache of silver and medical supplies that had been reported lost, but was actually diverted to fund the lifestyle of the then impoverished manor. The copper button Miss Marple had found was indeed from a livery, but it was the livery of a man who had acted as a lookout during those midnight thefts, a man who happened to be the late father of Joe Higgins, the blacksmith. The syndicate the village gossiped about was not a London entity at all. It was a local one, built on the bones of a wartime scandal. This revelation added a layer of social intrigue that changed the nature of every interaction Miss Marple had observed. The village was not just a collection of neighbours, it was a web of creditors and debtors bound by a shared crime. If Sterling had found the cash, the social standing of Lady Constance would be obliterated, the blacksmith's family name would be forever tarnished, and the solicitor, Mr. Ponsonby, would be exposed as the man who had legally laundered the stolen assets for decades. Even the vicar's wife had a stake. Her father had been the quartermaster who signed off on the lost supplies. The motive for murder was not industrial progress, but the absolute necessity of preventing the excavation of the tithe barn's foundations. Sterling was killed because he refused to accept a bribe to keep the past buried. Miss Marple's needles stilled as she synthesized these connections. She thought of the melodrama of the nightshade. It was a clever piece of psychological warfare. By staging the body in the great cornucopia, the killer had signaled to the rest of the conspirators that the harvest of secrets was over. It was a warning to remain silent. The blacksmith had been chosen as the scapegoat not just because of his argument with Sterling, but because his father's involvement in the original theft made him the perfect candidate for a man driven by ancestral shame. The soil testing extract ordered by the committee was the weapon provided by the elite to silence the man who threatened their legacy, a communal act of preservation that allowed everyone to keep their hands relatively clean by sharing the guilt. As the rain lashed against the window, Miss Marple realized that the another twist she expected would likely involve the solicitor. Mr. Ponsonby had been remarkably quiet since the arrest, a silence that Miss Marple recognized as the stillness of a man preparing a final legal barricade. She recalled the blue wax seal she had seen near the well. It wasn't from an estate document, it was from a revised will that Sterling had supposedly signed just before his death, a will that left the tithe barn to a preservation trust managed by Ponsonby himself. The murder was a joint venture. The manor provided the motive, the vicarage committee provided the means, and the solicitor provided the legal cover. They were a village of Macbeths, each believing that a single act of violence could ensure a lifetime of peace. Miss Marple folded her knitting with a quiet sigh. The past was not behind them, it was beneath them, supporting every house and every reputation in Chipping Devington. The murder of Alistair Sterling was a desperate attempt to stop the clock of history. The psychological observation she relied upon was now pointing toward a tragedy of collective self-preservation. The blacksmith was the only one truly innocent of the murder, yet he was the one most likely to suffer for the crimes of 40 years ago. Miss Marple realized that she had very little time to act before the solicitor finalized the preservation trust, effectively sealing the tithe barn and its secrets forever. She watched the shadows flicker on the wall, realizing that the real monster wasn't a London syndicate, but the enduring power of a respectable lie. The afternoon sun struggled to pierce through the heavy, stagnant mist that clung to the stone walls of the manor, casting the estate into a sickly, jaundiced light. Miss Marple, clutching a small basket of her finest damson preserves, made her way up the gravel drive with the deceptive frailty of a woman merely performing a neighbourly duty. She knew that Lady Constance would be in a state of high, brittle composure now that the blacksmith's arrest had seemingly stabilized the village's social order. It was the perfect moment to engage her in a game of psychological chess, a game played with soft smiles, domestic anecdotes, and the lethal precision of a well-placed question. She found Lady Constance in the morning room, a space filled with the scent of forced lilies and the oppressive atmosphere of a house that had spent 40 years holding its breath. The lady sat by the window, her spine as rigid as a spear, watching the damp garden with a look of profound, cold indifference. Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite her, her knitting needles already beginning their rhythmic, hypnotic click-clack. She began to speak not of the murder, but of the nature of old housekeepers and the peculiar way they preserved things. She talked of a cousin in St. Mary Mead, who had once discovered a hidden cache of silver beneath a floorboard, a discovery that had turned out to be quite a scandal during the war. "It is a funny thing about history, Constance," she murmured, her blue eyes fixed on the silver tea service that gleamed with a predatory brightness. "One can bury it under a barn or even under a new road, but it has a way of rising to the surface, much like a cork in water, especially when someone arrives with a map and a desire to dig." She watched Lady Constance's hand instinctively tighten around a lace handkerchief, the knuckles turning a sharp skeletal white. Miss Marple then shifted the conversation to the soil testing extract ordered by the committee, mentioning how remarkable it was that such a modern chemical should be needed for an old barn. She described the seed merchant's receipt in minute detail, noting the elegant hand that had signed it, and observed the way Lady Constance's gaze flickered toward the writing desk in the corner. "The inspector is so very fond of his bottles and his tinctures," Miss Marple continued, her voice as smooth as cream. "He finds it so satisfying to discover a poison in a blacksmith's shed, but he forgets that a bottle is merely a container. It's the hand that pours the drinker perhaps treats the glass that truly matters." I often think of a similar case involving a gardener who was blamed for a missing necklace, only for the jewelry to be found inside a hollowed-out pumpkin at the village fete. The person who put it there wasn't a thief. You see, they were a director, staging a play for an audience of one. The reaction was exactly what Miss Marple had anticipated. Lady Constance's mask of aristocratic boredom did not slip, but her voice took on a sharp, metallic edge. She spoke of the necessity of progress and the unfortunate greed of men like Alistair Sterling, who didn't understand the sanctity of tradition. It was a defense of the social order that was entirely unconvincing, her eyes darting toward the ancient stone sundial visible through the window. Miss Marple watched her with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen under glass. She noted the way the lady repeatedly adjusted her pearls and the way her breath hitched when Miss Marple mentioned the copper livery button. "Such a distinctive button," Miss Marple mused. "It reminded me of the uniforms the footmen wore here during the war. I imagine one would find a great many things in the tithe barn if one looked beneath the foundations, things that were reported lost to the War Office, but were never truly gone." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 4 decades of shared guilt. Lady Constance did not move, but the atmosphere in the room changed, turning from cold to absolute zero. She looked at Miss Marple with a newfound, terrifying clarity, realizing that the elderly lady with the knitting was not a guest, but a witness. Miss Marple rose to leave, declining the offer of tea with a gentle, final smile. She had seen the critical reaction, the tightening of the jaw, the frantic checking of the clock, and the way the lady's gaze had lingered on the solicitor's blue-sealed folder resting on the sideboard. The psychological game was over, and the suspect had revealed her hand by trying to hide it behind a wall of ancestral pride. As she stepped back out into the damp village air, Miss Marple felt a profound sadness. The final revelation was now inevitable, and the secrets of Chipping Divington were about to be brought into the light of day. She had watched the predator in the drawing room, and now she only had to wait for the final, desperate move that would close the harvest for good. The gathering in the solar of the manor that evening was conducted in a silence so thick it felt as though the very walls were leaning in to listen. The room was illuminated by the flicker of a dying fire and the harsh, clinical light of a single electric lamp on the solicitor's desk. Inspector Slack stood by the door, his face a mask of impatient triumph, while Joe Higgins sat huddled in a chair, his soot-stained hands trembling in his lap. Lady Constance remained by the window, her silhouette as rigid as an iron fire-dog, and Mr. Ponsonby, the solicitor, sat behind a stack of blue-sealed documents with a look of professional detachment. It was into this atmosphere of impending judgment that Miss Marple stepped, her knitting bag on her arm, and a look of profound, gentle determination in her blue eyes. She did not wait for an invitation, she simply settled into a chair and began to untangle the web that had strangled the piece of Chipping Devington. "I believe," Miss Marple began, her voice cutting through the inspector's bluster with the clarity of a bell, "that we are about to make a very grave mistake. It is so easy to see what one is expected to see, like the time old Mrs. Pring found a burglar in her pantry who turned out to be her own grandson looking for the jam. You are looking at Joe Higgins and seeing a vengeful man, and you are looking at the nightshade and seeing a simple theft. But if you look at the human heart and the history of this village, you see a very different story." She settled her needles, the rhythmic click providing a heartbeat to the room. Mr. Sterling was not killed because of a road or a forge. He was killed because he was a man of modern science who had begun to dig into a 40-year-old grave. He had found the cache of stolen medical supplies and silver beneath the tithe barn, the treasures that funded the survival of this manor after the Great War. A sharp silence fell over the room. Miss Marple looked toward Lady Constance, who didn't move. "Mr. Sterling was a threat to the very foundation of your social standing, Constance. He found the copper button of the footman who helped your father move those crates in 1918. But he was also a threat to you, Mr. Ponsonby. As the executor of the estate, you have known for decades that the manor's wealth was built on wartime theft. When Sterling refused your bribe to keep the tithe barn sealed, you realized that the legacy of 3 families was at stake. The nightshade was not a crude tincture from a blacksmith's shed. It was the concentrated digitalis extract ordered by the Restoration Committee, the very extract listed on the London receipt I found at the apothecary's. It was a communal murder, Inspector. The committee provided the means, but the hand that treated Mr. Sterling's glass during the luncheon was a hand that knew exactly where to find the poison. Inspector Slack scoffed, but Miss Marple continued, her gaze unwavering. Staging the body in the great cornucopia was the cleverest part of the plan. It was meant to look like a rustic, symbolic crime-earth sort of thing an uneducated man like Joe might do. But the nightshade in the pocket was a literary flourish, a signature of someone who views life as a theatrical performance. And the blue wax seal I found near the well, it wasn't from a document, Inspector. It was from the vial of poison itself, which had been sealed with the solicitor's own midnight blue wax to ensure it didn't leak before the luncheon. Mr. Ponsonby prepared the dose, and Lady Constance, you ensured the tithe barn would be left to a trust that you and the solicitor would control, effectively burying the evidence of the theft forever. The solicitor attempted to rise, his face a ghastly shade of grey. "You have no proof of such a wild accusation," he hissed. Miss Marple reached into her bag and pulled out the small, discarded fragment of the London receipt. "Your own clerk, Mr. Ponsonby, signed this receipt, but the order was placed in Lady Constance's name. And the copper button? It was found in the straw because it fell from the old livery coat you used to disguise yourself when you moved the body in the dead of night, Lady Constance. You thought the fire of the festival would destroy all evidence, but you were careless with the small things. You framed the son for the father's old sins, never realizing that a woman who has spent her life observing the patterns of a village knows that an honest man doesn't hide behind a theatrical display of gauds and nightshade." The inspector moved toward the solicitor, But Miss Marple held up a hand. "There is one more thing. The soil on the vicar's wife's shoes. She was the one who helped you dig the decoy hole in the garden to hide the remaining extract. You all shared the guilt to ensure no one could speak." As the inspector finally led the solicitor and Lady Constance away, Miss Marple turned to Joe Higgins and took his hand. "The truth is a very difficult thing to live with, Joe, but it is much better than a lie that eats a village from the inside out. The mystery of the harvest was solved, not by forensic science, but by a deep understanding of the lengths to which a man or a lady will go to keep the ghosts of the past in the grave." The morning after the arrests at the manor, Chipping Devington awoke to a world that felt both lighter and more sombre, as if a great, dusty curtain had finally been drawn back from a window that had been shuttered for decades. The persistent rain had washed away the last traces of the harvest festival, leaving the village green a pristine expanse of damp, emerald grass. Miss Marple sat in the window seat of her lodgings, her hands cradled around a warm cup of Earl Grey tea, watching the familiar rhythms of the village resume. To a stranger passing through, the scene would have appeared perfectly idyllic. The butcher was sweeping his doorstep, the postman was making his rounds with a cheery whistle, and the church bells were chiming for the morning service. Yet, beneath this veneer of parochial peace, the social foundations of the parish had been fundamentally reshaped. The fall of Lady Constance and the exposure of Mr. Ponsonby had done more than solve a murder. They had dismantled a hierarchy that had ruled the village since the end of the Great War. As she watched the villagers gather in small, huddled groups near the well, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of collective memory. She noted how quickly the narrative was being rewritten in local stores. Mrs. Pringle, the postmistress, was already telling anyone who would listen that she had always found the solicitor's midnight blue wax seals decidedly ominous, and that Lady Constance's aristocratic bearing had always struck her as a mask for a deeply troubled conscience. It was a fascinating display of human resilience, the way people distanced themselves from a fallen idol once the shadow of the law had touched it. The village was not just processing a crime, it was performing a ritual of purification, shedding its shared history of silence as easily as a snake sheds its skin. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered the vicar near the gate of the tithe barn. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single weekend, his shoulders slumped and his eyes clouded with a profound, spiritual exhaustion. He spoke in hushed tones of the shattering of trust and the difficulty of ministering to a congregation that had nurtured such darkness in its heart. Miss Marple listened with a sympathetic nod, but her reply was characteristically grounded in her understanding of the human condition. She reminded him that a village is very much like a garden. If one ignores the weeds for 40 years, one cannot be surprised when they eventually choke the life out of the flowers. The discovery of the stolen silver and the truth about the war years was painful, she admitted, but it was the only way to ensure the new growth at Chipping Devington would be healthy and true. The blacksmith, Joe Higgins, had returned to his forge. For the first time in a week, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil echoed across the green. It was a hopeful sound, a signal that the honest industry of the village was being restored. Miss Marple had visited him briefly to return the copper button she had used as evidence, and she was struck by the change in his demeanor. He no longer looked like a man burdened by ancestral shame. He looked like a man who had finally been granted the right to own his own future. The industrialist, Mr. Sterling, was gone, and his modernization plans would likely be tied up in legal probate for years, but the tithe barn was no longer a tomb for secrets. It was just an old building again, awaiting a new purpose that didn't involve the concealment of wartime theft. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden fingers of light across the churchyard, Miss Marple took up her knitting for the last time that day. She thought of Alistair Sterling, a man who had come to the village with the arrogance of the present and had been undone by the weight of the past. He had been a catalyst for truth, even if his motives had been rooted in his own brand of greed. It was a classic irony that a man so focused on the future should be the one to unearth the skeletons of 1918. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and smoothed the soft wool of her knitting. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not in the triumph of the law, but in the restoration of the village's equilibrium. The body beneath the harvest festival had been a tragedy of self-preservation, a reminder that the desire to protect a reputation can often be more lethal than the desire for gold. Miss Marple finished the final stitch of her scarf and looked out at the darkening green. The shadows were lengthening, but they were no longer the heavy, suffocating shadows of a shared lie. Chipping Devington would eventually heal, the story of the lady and the solicitor becoming another layer of local law to be recounted over tea. But for her, the case was a final confirmation of her lifelong belief that there is no place on earth so peaceful that it cannot hide a human heart in turmoil. She closed the curtains softly, a click of the latch sounding a final note of closure. The harvest was over, the grain had been winnowed from the chaff, and the village was, at long last, free to begin again.